also the director of the Chantlani Research Center, and whose research is focused on health equity research generally, and is also a senior scientist with the Population Health Research Institute. Sonia did a PhD with health research methodologies, and now holds a Canada Research Chair in ethnic diversity and cardiovascular disease in the from the Heart and Stroke Foundation, and also the Michael G. DeGroot Chair in Population Health Research, with strong interests in questions around vascular disease, but population or and ancestral origin, women and cardiovascular disease, more recently some work in COVID-19, and then became the acting Associate VP of Equity and Inclusion. So thank you, Sonia. I'll hand it over to you and we'll come back with some questions in a little while.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa, for the invitation, and to Erin. And I very much feel a product of McMaster and HEI. I actually started off doing my master's in design, measurement, and evaluation in the Department of CE&B, formerly known as, and then began my PhD as the first PhD class. There were 3 of us in the first PhD HRM class, and I think I started that in 1998. So I'm sure some of the audience were not born at that time, so I'll get right into it. But it's a pleasure to be here, and I think, you know, one of the reasons why did I step into the acting role, just to start off, I'm very passionate about equity, diversity, inclusion issues, and the permanent AVP, the very first one, left rather suddenly to take a different opportunity. So I'm just bridging in the central campus office until the next permanent AVP is selected, and that process is underway. But I've learned a lot, and it's been an interesting experience. I'll share a bit with you shortly. So today I'll review, and I'll try and leave time for questions, certainly, all of the initiatives you may hear about regarding EDI in university settings. And then I will come to some of the work we've done in the Department of Medicine with respect to selection committee practices and policies, and also then come to the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Statement, and how we're starting to develop a standard way to assess these statements. And it may be that you have either completed an EDI statement or you're on the reviewer side of EDI statements. And I hope some of our work you will find interesting and potentially useful. So just to start off with some key terms, because more and more you probably hear EDI used all the time as a noun, but if you break it down, and I think it's important to just really reflect on what each of the terms mean. So equity refers to the principle of fairness, doesn't necessarily mean equality, but really the principle of fairness, and can be both an approach, so an equity strategy, or it could be an outcome. So you're looking for equity in a certain outcome. Diversity refers to difference, and that can be difference with respect to a number of characteristics: age, class, ethnicity, gender, etc. Inclusion is often thought of as the ultimate outcome of equity and diversity initiatives, because it refers to creating a workplace in which there is diversity and all the diverse individuals can contribute to the best of their ability and feel, you know, a sense of belonging in the workplace. So that's kind of the ultimate outcome of many of the E and D initiatives. And finally, inclusive excellence, if you read the McMaster strategy with respect to EDI, is often referred to, the concept being that, first off, diversity initiatives are not at odds with traditional initiatives in which we are seeking merit-based, selection of our future leaders, whereas in fact, inclusive excellence refers to excellence based on academic merit and diversity, often being referred to as two sides of the same coin. So they're not mutually exclusive, yet should be considered together. Now, if you look at the literature with respect to EDI, and this paper reflects a recent scoping review of physician conferences and discussions with respect to aspects of EDI in North America. This was put together by a group at U of T. You can see that from 2018 up until present day, there was really an uptick in the discussions with respect to EDI. And if you look at conference content from 2018, and if we could continue to present day, you will see in many of the scientific conferences we attend, there are either like dedicated sessions on some aspects of EDI, or there is an attempt to diversify conference speakers, chairs, etc. And you can see some of the discussion topics include bias, you will see equity, diversity, inclusion, positionality, power. And when these authors traced it back to, why all of a sudden did we see this conversation start, they did trace it back to some events that occurred in North American society that got everybody talking, including the Me Too movement in the entertainment sector, as well as from the racial perspective, the death of George Floyd. And so these issues that we face in society certainly trickle into our dialogues within the university. And this has really driven some of the recent conversations with respect to EDI. Now, I often will start with some Mythbusters with respect to some of the controversial areas of EDI. And I've included some references there. And I have, you'll see, if we start with number one, underrepresentation of, in brackets, I put certain group, is a pipeline problem. If I just focused in on gender, for example, in academic medicine or health sciences, if somebody says, why don't we have more women in leadership? A common response is, well, we don't have enough women in the pipeline to actually be assessed to become the leader. And certainly, yes, this depends on the certain group we're referring to, but our kind of main topics within academia thus far has been around gender and race ethnicity. And for point one, this pipeline argument, if we look deeply at the data, we don't see that. We certainly see there are women completing undergraduate degrees, graduate degrees, and entering the academy at the assistant professor level across most of our departments at an equal, if not slightly higher percentage rate compared to men. The second myth is, well, it's not, if the pipeline's full and we have enough, in this case, example, women, then maybe we have to fix the women and convince them just to start applying, kind of putting the issue of lack of women in leadership on the individual. Now, in part, it may be that the culture is such, or the acculturation of the woman is such that they are not applying for jobs, but actually trying to change people, individuals, to then solve the problem of lack of leadership is likely not going to fix the problem. The third is when we talk about our biases and our unconscious or overt bias, most people, the first reaction would be, I'm not biased, especially in universities, because we're highly educated. We seek out the university. We're often left-leaning politically, and it's kind of offensive to be then told, you're biased. But we all have certain unconscious biases, and I'll come to that later. The fourth is that if we just have everyone do unconscious bias training and they are aware of their biases and we tell them how to think, we'll also fix the problem. But of course, as intellectual academics, we don't want to be told how to think. We have, our rights to our own thinking and expression of that for the most part. So kind of this trying to control bias has not been shown to be very effective. And then finally, this point I raised earlier around the belief that any equity initiative contravenes meritocracy or a merit-based system. And the merit-based system is typically in academia, people who work hard, who are smart, will get the grants, get the papers, and they are the ones who will eventually become the leaders. Some domains, that's true, and it works well. In others, it is not necessarily what happens to lead to leadership. In other areas, it may be individuals who are in certain networks are thought of more commonly, are like the current leadership and are selected on that basis. And so in that scenario, equity initiatives may lead to more individuals being considered leaders and have the skill set to do it. They might have the academic, but it just kind of leads from a closed network approach, more broader consideration of who may be a future leader. Now, when we look at McMaster strategic plan, this was created in 2018 and began to be implemented in 2019 to present. And it was created by the first Associate Vice President, Equity Inclusion, Dr. Arig Al-Shaba. And if you look at the components of the strategy, there are four main ones. And the first in the blue circle is what is called community and compositional diversity. And just a moment on that, because I am very pro collecting information and metrics and trying to change how we do business and then remeasuring. But there are some limitations to only considering EDI initiatives based on compositional diversity. So compositional diversity is we determine who we are typically through surveys or self-report. And we might say that, 70% of our department is men, 30% is women. And then if we just put, a balance in terms of women in leadership or racialized individuals, everything will be solved. And while it is important to know who we are, there is much more, besides in an individual's identity characteristics that have to be considered when we're considering, our community and our principles. And so that is one component, but the other components and the intersectionality, obviously, of the individual is very important to consider. The other components of the strategy include training for individuals, so the individual understanding of EDI initiatives, unconscious bias, and then infusing these principles at all levels in the university, from the senior leadership team to the staff to our governance. And then a final component is the academic content and context, which is considering how do we infuse equity and diversity principles in the research work that we do, our teaching and learning, and the broader culture of McMaster. And so within these four components of the EDI strategy are a number of actionable items. Now, I did mention earlier that one key component would be the blue circle, which is understanding our own position in the university, our own lived experience with respect to equity and diversity, our sense of inclusion, and our understanding of our own unconscious biases. Changing individual understanding and beliefs, I also did mention, is not the only way to try and bring about change. And in fact, studies would show we can't change everything by just trying to change mindsets. So the next circle refers to structural changes, whereby we create policies and practice through those policies to bring about structural change. And I'll go through this with respect to some things that we've tried in the Department of Medicine. And then finally, you can have a checklist of things you have to consider with respect to EDI. But in order to make everything change from a systems level and to bring about a cultural change, you also need the senior leaders to be role modeling the kind of belief in the importance of equity and diversity initiatives. And this kind of combination of policy plus role modeling then leads to this ideal hope of infusion of equity, diversity principles throughout the academy. Now, the Globe and Mail did an analysis, and you may see this as a kind of regular series in the Globe and Mail with respect to the U15, so the 15 universities across Canada. And they have done this by gender as well as racialization. And here I just show from 1999 to 2019, so a 20-year period, how things have changed with respect to women at McMaster in various positions, from assistant professor to high senior leadership positions such as vice president, provost, president. And you can see that over time, there certainly has been an increase in the percentage of women in leadership positions. And this includes beyond full professor to things such as dean, associate, VP, vice president, and our current provost, as you know, is a woman. Now, again, this is looking at just gender without the intersection of race, and the majority of women leaders within McMaster University are white women. And so our racialized colleagues will say, okay, some progress has been made, but we need to remember there are certain groups based on their racialization who need to be considered, and do we have their processes in place to ensure that that could happen? When we look at our hospitals, and many of us also work in the hospitals, we can see that there are more women leaders at the senior leadership level, typically in the executives, vice president levels of hospitals, and this is across Ontario. If we again look at the proportion of leaders, men and women in the hospital sector who are racialized, it is a much smaller percentage of leaders. Within Hamilton, some of you may have been in conversations with our hospital partners where they are also looking at their EDI approaches and strategies. Hamilton Health Sciences recently went through a series of town halls, a survey, an advisory committee, and now they have brought in a physician leader for Hamilton Health Sciences, who is Dr. Cassia Johnson, a pediatrician within Department of Pediatrics, as well as a full-time EDI lead, Rochelle Reed, who recently started. And they are tasked with doing quite a lot to look at existing policies, revise them, and address everything from physicians, staff, and of course, so importantly, inclusion and the sense of inclusion of patients who attend our hospitals. As I mentioned, the hospitals, if you look across Canada, and there's a paper in CMAJ 2022 where the hospital leadership is examined by gender and racial status versus the constituents they serve. And in many cases, we have certain diverse regions of the country where all of the leadership are men and women who are not reflecting that diversity. And so this analysis in CMAJ calls into question, should we try and be more proactive in the diversification of hospital leaders? So if we look at all that has happened since 2018 locally, we can see the Central University formalizing the Equity and Inclusion Office in 2018. In 2018, within the Department of Medicine, the position I currently hold, we created the Associate Chair of Equity and Diversity to address some of the issues in that space. Pediatrics, family medicine, psychiatry, and Dr. Schwartz as your lead in HEI followed shortly after. And now, as of February 1st, we will have an Associate Dean, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion in the Faculty of Health Sciences. So at the faculty level, hopefully coordinating much of what we do in FHS. And that speaks to the importance of senior leadership in FHS have placed in issues of equity and diversity and inclusion. And as I mentioned, Hamilton Health Sciences has recently come up with the strategy, St. Joseph's Hospital, the same. And this smaller arrow underneath that does demonstrate that in our professional programs in Faculty of Health Sciences, there is also a lot of work underway with a dedicated Indigenous pathway for medical students, now a pilot for Black medical students, admission to McMaster, Black undergraduate students for the Bachelor of Health Sciences program, and in the postgraduate medical education space, there is a dedicated EDI and framework that is being developed. So you can see that across Faculty of Health Sciences and the university, these conversations in EDI have led to specific programs and initiatives. Now, I'll come to the Department of Medicine and give you some tangible examples of what we observed, what we implemented. And I will say, throughout all of my experiences in this space, there is no one algorithm or kind of cookie cutter approach to EDI that you can just apply. Each of our departments have a unique culture, a unique history, and also goals. And so in the Department of Medicine, what got me kind of very interested in starting some EDI initiatives was really the observation that our leaders were selected in a way that I didn't understand. So it meant maybe not a transparent fashion. The decision makers were often a homogeneous group. And on the rare chance that I was part of a decision-making table, sometimes comments such as, so-and-so is not the right fit, or their communication style doesn't really fit with, our usual practice. I would often hear, the junior person's not ready for a role because they don't have experience, yet at the same time, there weren't term limits on the current leaders. So how could junior leaders get that experience? And then, other comments like, I don't know if she could handle this because she has 3 kids. So those are kind of those off the cuff comments that can occur. They're called doubt raisers or red flag comments. And by creating processes for leadership selection, we might minimize those and maximize the focus on the merit of the candidate to do the job that is needed. So those comments that we sometimes make or judgments are sometimes conscious, but usually unconscious biases that we may, rush to judgment. And Daniel Kahneman, with his thinking fast, thinking slow, system 1 and 2 thinking has won the Nobel Prize to delineating these way we think. And when I say we all have unconscious biases, we likely do, because these are internalized ways that we judge the world that can often occur very early in life based on where we were raised, what our parents said to us, what we internalized as being normal in our school system, etc. So we can learn about our unconscious biases through this implicit bias testing. Harvard website is listed here. You can learn where your blind spots are, where you may have a blind spot with respect to gender, disability, race. And why is this important? Well, at least you can understand where you may have blind spots. You may check some of those comments before you blurt them out. And you may just be a little more cautious and switch from system one thinking to system two thinking when you're around a decision-making table. Now, I mentioned that it's hard to change the way we think. And Iris Bonet's written a really great book. I'd recommend it, called Gender Equity, What Works. She works at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and it's quite an evidence-based assessment of equity initiatives. And she gives this great example of, if you, at this time she wrote the book, so must be about 5 years ago. If you looked across the United States, you might see that all of the principal violinists of the major orchestras were men. So, why is that? Women violinists are quite frequent. So there you go. Pipeline is full of women violinists, but no one's ever the principal violinist. So they looked at how the audition structure was. And if you play an instrument, it's typically you go out on stage, you play your instrument, 3 people in the front score you, and the best person wins. So what if there were biases with respect to the look of the violinist, and wasn't only the scores weren't only reflected based on the sound the violin made. So they put in place a curtain. So this is an example of interrupting or changing a structure that is separate from the individual. Put a curtain in there so the auditors could only hear the audition. And when they did that, more women would move into the principal violinist position of the orchestra. So that's an example of a structural change that can help us lead to more diversification. And in this case, the leader of an orchestra, but in our cases, could lead to diversification of leaders. So this is often referred to equity by design. There are a number of strategies that you can use. Setting targets for underrepresented groups, increasing the counter stereotyping. So there are a number of papers and books written on think leader, think male. So if we always think about who the CEO of a big bank is, who the CEO of a hospital is, and it's typically a white male, then changing up who leaders are, of course, merit-based, helps people start to see that leaders can look different. Seeing is believing, so let's look around us and see who our leaders are. But really, I'd focus on things that we can do in our own ecosystem to try and bring about change. And much of the literature supports that transparency in terms of how leaders are selected, letting people know about leadership opportunities, and these 2 strategies, in addition to that, having some criteria by which we equitably remunerate people for work, are the kind of areas that if we can achieve success in these domains, we generally bring about more equity across a number of area, be it gender, race, etc. As well, the literature would suggest when people understand how decisions are made, so this speaks to transparency, they're more likely to be able to live with an outcome that doesn't necessarily benefit them or someone they think should get the position because they understand the process. Now, in the Department of Medicine, we did revise our selection committee process. We first wanted to know who we were as a department. We didn't have that at on hand. So we undertook a survey of our department members, and we had a good response rate. The survey was anonymous, and it helped us see, who we were. And I show here by gender, roughly balanced in the younger faculty members, more male above the age of 60, When we looked by ethnicity, you can see that we do have quite a lot of diversity in the department. When we looked at, in particular, did anyone identify as Indigenous or Black? We had no Indigenous faculty members of 330 within the Department of Medicine, and 0.5 FTE at this time in the Department of Medicine. We've done better. That's helpful because we can say, we want to do better in certain domains, and, we can be proactive in who we try and recruit, and also reflective as to why we have no faculty members from those equity deserving groups. So first we did who we are, and this helped us then set up our plan for selection committees in terms of the compositional diversity of our selection committees. So what goes into choosing the best candidate? We reflected on that, and we came up with the Department of Medicine equity checklist, recognizing that we don't want to just rely on checklists to infuse EDI in our department, but it can be one component. And physicians who are busy are often, like these checklists. There are lots of surgical checklists. So this equity checklist, the chair of selection committees starts off with this. And there are a number of steps and considerations for the chair. I'll just point to point 3, which is the diversity of the selection committee. At the time we started, because we had 70% men in the department, 30% women, we said of all our selection committees, at least 30% should be women. We're revising this now to Equity Checklist 3.0, where we will also add diversity based on racialization as part of that. And the chair had to complete an unconscious bias module that just helps the chair understand those issues, including those off-the-cuff comments, so the chair can try and make sure that the discussion on the selection committee is really focused on the merit and not personal characteristics. We built in standardized questions, standardized scoring, and most recently added the requirement of the candidate submitting an equity, diversity, inclusion statement. Now, this is, something we're doing for recruiting new faculty members and also in leadership positions. And this is what the checklist looks like. We collect all of this information, and on an annual basis, I, with a small advisory group, will review it and see, what's working, what's not working, where can we tweak it. So we're always trying to modify as we go. This is an example of a series of questions. We want to ask the same questions to all candidates. But how do you come up with the questions? And we used to have a question bank that no one spent too much time tailoring to who was needed as the new faculty or new leader in the department. So now we ask the selection committee to, get on one Zoom before we start interviewing to work through who we are looking for as a leader. That can be on the basis of an external review of the division or position. And then we try and tailor the questions to reflect, those points. And then, of course, we have a scoring rubric, and it's up to the committee if weights want to be placed on, important areas deemed to be more important than others. The next part of the process is really to try and diversify the candidate pool. There's a lot of literature with respect to this. If you're in a rush to recruit, you often don't have time to go and make sure you're shaking the trees and getting as many candidates as possible. We have started tapping people on the shoulder 1 or 2 years before a position is coming available. So we're getting people to start thinking if they want to apply. We try to encourage an external search if it's possible to do so from the financial perspective. And we really encourage our division directors, if they're recruiting new faculty, to take the time to advertise for the position to try and get a diverse candidate pool. If we only hire from within, McMaster, we're going to lead to, just creating more of ourselves. And what is the problem with that? Well, oftentimes we're going to miss some really important diverse opinions, or we're going to make mistakes based on we're always thinking alike on all issues. That's known as groupthink. We do the scoring and blinded voting. And another component we built into the committee around the table is after we finish the interviews and done the scoring, we will start the discussion, and we always ask the junior most person on the committee to start with their comments first, and then we end with the chair making their comments. If we did it the other way, we often find the junior person doesn't feel comfortable speaking up. And then when it comes to vote, you don't have to vote with the best mean score of the candidate. You can vote after the discussion, change your mind, and we use a blinded system. So then again, you don't feel that, oh, the chair saw I didn't vote along with him, and maybe there will be some consequences of that. So it's blinded voting. And then the chair receives it, and we try and determine as ahead of time, are we just going with a democratic vote? So 51% endorse one candidate, that candidate's a winning candidate, or we're going to do an alternative threshold, like we need 70% of the committee to endorse one candidate before we choose them. So we've played around with some interesting variations of this, and my colleague Will Harper, who's a division director of endocrinology, came to me early in my tenure as associate chair equity diversity with this idea that uses a game theory approach, which is called Diversitive agreement versus the Nash equilibrium. And essentially, the idea here is if you have diversified your committee, you've done all of those things that I described in terms of minimizing bias, and you're left with two candidates who are equally meritorious, and the committee can't really decide between them, and they haven't reached the certainty threshold you've set based on the composition of your committee, then in the presence of that maximal information where you can't decide, then you go to a variance strategy, which is a flip of a coin or a random selection. So you've got two kind of equal candidates, flip of a coin, and there you choose your candidate based on that. Now, we have pilot tested this in 4 different committees in our department, and we know that our colleagues are uncomfortable with the flip of a coin, and they really try their best to make the best decision and avoid the variance strategy. And I'll give you an example. If you've had 10 people around in your selection committee, and as I told you, we have a requirement that at least 30% are women, but let's say in this case, 40% are women. And we then would set a certainty threshold of, you have to exceed 70% agreement behind a candidate in order to choose them. That's an example, so that the men on the committee, if they only voted for the male candidate, wouldn't be able to outvote the women, thinking only along the lines, and maybe rather simplistically, that men will only vote for men and women will only vote for women. But you build in a higher certainty threshold. If you don't reach that after a lot of discussion and agreement, it goes to a flip of the coin. So we tested this, and we published a paper on this in 4 of our committees. And I won't go into the details, but I'd encourage you to read the paper. It was very interesting that in the majority of our committees that we ran, if you see, we look at the scores comparing the candidates. So lower score is better, and position 1 is the individual who is chosen for the leadership position. That in the majority of cases, our scoring system correlated with who was finally ranked as the leader. And in only one scenario, we were pushed towards a flip of the coin, meaning in only one of the 4 scenarios did we have a situation where we didn't cross the certainty threshold comparing our final group of candidates. The committee was really deadlocked in whom they endorsed, and it went to flip of the coin. Because this was a pilot study, that flip of a coin recommendation went to the chair, who could have the final say about who would be selected. We have learned from this that the real key drivers of having a really unbiased selection committee seems to be maximizing your candidate diversity, just so that you're shaking the trees to get anyone who might be thinking about applying, as well as diversifying the selection committee, and building in those standard measures of a scoring rubric and blinded voting. When we put those features into place, we generally have a very good, robust discussion selection procedure, in a sense that it's a fair process. A second example is a randomized trial that came from researchers at U of T. They were focusing on the fact that, if you read the I think it's Michelle Sandberg, the Facebook CFO, who wrote a book called Leaning In, which is like more women should lean into, work at high levels in corporations. They tapped in on the fact that women may be less likely to self-promote, and in the area of promotion and tenure, may be less likely to say, oh, okay, I'm going to go for promotion. So rather than leaving it to the individual to opt in, they created an intervention where they looked at the opt out. So they identified people in academia who would be eligible for promotion and sent a notification to them that you're eligible for promotion. Would you like to go forward? If the individual didn't want to go forward, they could opt out. But that intervention led to more women going forward for promotion. And so that's an example of a structural intervention that can lead to equity. And I'd also encourage you to read this. It's a fascinating randomized trial. Finally, I'll come to the EDI statement work, and why did we think we should have some standardized way of assessing an EDI statement. The main reason was that there was so much variation between reviewers around a table deciding what makes a good EDI statement versus not. And I observed this in a number of FHS tables that I was at, that there was a great divergence of opinion on these EDI statements. So we went through and looked for existing rubrics. We found one from Berkeley, and we've modified it to make sure we're asking and assessing domains we think are important. And Lisa Schwartz is part of this committee. We have representation of reviewers from many of our colleagues across FHS. And our research assistant created 5 scenarios of like a definitely bad EDI statement, or it could often be very short with kind of nothing much to say, to a 2-page longer EDI statement. And then we took this modified rubric and asked all of our reviewers to review all of the same statements, and then assessed the agreement between reviewers on their scoring of these statements. The domains that we're looking at are shown here. So competency, positionality, teaching, research, community involvement, future plans, and accountability. And the maximum score it is 120, because we score this on a Likert of 1 to 10, and there are 12 questions in total. If an individual does not have a component such as research in their statement because they are not a researcher, then you can adjust for that as well. And I'll just go a little more quickly, but here's an example of the criteria. We do give some more context by way of an example for the criteria, so the reviewer gets a sense of what we're looking for. and then a breadth of responses are possible. And we've run this with the 5 sample statements, and you can see here that if you just focus in on the total score, we have, high total scores in 2 scenarios of 99 out of the 120 or 95, and then we have lower scores, the lowest being 27 versus 41. These are the mean scores. You can see that the reviewers' overall ranking closely aligned with the creator of these statements. And then if we look at our ICC, the agreement between the reviewers, you can see it's very high. So this is in our kind of made up statements. The next phase is to take real statements, blinded, from the Department of Medicine, from the Canada Research Chair, Faculty of Health Sciences, work in the past years, and see if this rubric does as well with real EDI statements. And this is the current phase we're in, just waiting for high rep approval. Then we'll move into phase 2. So it's an example of we're trying to devise and validate a rubric to assess these EDI statements. And there is a lot of interest from other groups and FHS and across campus to have some sort of standardized metric. So just to wrap up, what are the tangible products of an EDI strategy? In the Department of Medicine, this has led to more transparency in leadership selection and base salaries. I believe we've built a more inclusive environment. Not everybody's happy all of the time, but in general, when we've asked questions about inclusion in our department, it seems, more inclusive than not. We're deliberately recruiting Indigenous and Black faculty member. We have increased the diversity in our division directors and other leaders, and we always take an EDI lens in the work that we do. And I will say that having Mark Crowther as a department chair, who's been very proactive and supportive of these initiatives, has counted for a lot. If you have a department chair who's not interested in this, yet as an associate chair, I'm really trying to push a mandate, we wouldn't be able to have done as much as we've had. So we all need that close alignment and close relationship. On the university side, there's so many initiatives underway. As I mentioned, the EDI strategy has met most of its mandate to 2022 and has another 2 years of work to do. But overall, I think a lot of progress has been made. And finally, to achieve greater equity, we have to think about, what are our institutional priorities? Do our leaders reflect and act those priorities? How do we facilitate more equitable, transparent hiring? What about optimizing flexible work arrangements, optimizing our environment to enable a diversity of faculty members, being inclusive, knowing who we are as departments and divisions so that we can reflect those in our leadership and selection committees, treating EDI not as a burden, but rather as an innovation challenge. There's so much that can be done, and HEI would be the perfect department to do some real innovations here. And then, as I mentioned, not one approach can work for every department. So measure, design, intervene, remeasure, and see if things are working. So I'll stop there. I know I didn't leave much time for questions, but if there are any, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. That's excellent. Many thanks for so much to think about and the possibilities and challenges that we've got ahead of us, even as we're continue to work on things. I will just remind everyone to feel free to either raise your hand for questions so that we can take things in order, or add comments and questions to the chat. And while we're waiting for people to start, I'll take my opportunity I mean, you've talked a little bit about, particularly in the Department of Medicine, the kinds of successes and changes that you've seen. Can you speak more broadly about the university, and are we doing well? We seem to get acknowledged for it from time to time, but what's really going on, particularly from your view, is the acting VP.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing to know if you're doing well. I think it's important to try and measure. And I also mentioned there's some pros and then some incomplete information you get from just measuring people based on identity characteristics. But for areas where we really need to see change, that's a starting point. So do we have more women and racialized leaders? How are we doing with respect to recruitment of faculty of underrepresented groups, such as our Black colleagues and Indigenous colleagues? I think those would be kind of two measures. I think I'm seeing progress in those areas for sure. In my conversations with senior leaders, we are starting to see the approach to selection committees change. There's certainly the faculty requirement to have an employment equity facilitator and also a described process. For staff at the university, that's not a policy yet. However, there is the use of the employment equity facilitators approach. I'm heartened by a number of grassroots groups who have developed and then gone to various funding pockets requesting dedicated funding to help them go from a grassroots group to actually a coordinated group. And the STEER proposal is one avenue to enable that. And I know HEI has a successful initiative underway. So I'm seeing progress there. I think long term, I guess a concern would be there might be a lot of hype right now and some funding opportunities, but most of the equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives do really require that ongoing commitment. And so I would be concerned if it were only short term and then resources were taken away, or if anyone thought, okay, we've achieved everything, we can stop now. I think that this has to be something that continues and then becomes something of a kind of cultural norm at McMaster. When that will happen, I don't know, but I am optimistic with respect to the changes I've seen so far.
And it reflects a comment that Marlise Simons made in the chat around sustained support. I think Russell, you've had your hand up first, and then Alfonso.
So yeah, hopefully a quick one, or we can talk about this later. Sonia, great talk. I'm just curious about, from the students' perspective, what are we hearing about the changes we've made and the directions that we still need to go?
Yes, great question, Russ. And I'd invite other people to comment on that. My personal sense is the students are like wanting change faster than they're seeing. Like the students are like, how come things look like this? And why isn't there more diversity? And how come our leaders look relatively similar? And so they're really pushing for change. And we do feel this kind of age class, I think, from like our younger student body. And it is a really diverse body, which is so great at Mac. And the pace at which things might be changing over in the senior leadership. So I do feel that. But, we have to be thoughtful about our approaches. I do keep reiterating that one approach that works in one department may not work in another. We need to be thoughtful and inclusive in the strategies that we initiate to bring about more equity. So I think a key component is to, continue to have the conversations and keep the door open for that two-way dialogue. I learn a lot from the students and hearing where they're at. And, hopefully they hear from us that we're thinking about it and we're trying to bring about change, but we want to do that in a thoughtful and inclusive way.
Thanks. Alfonso, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. Very, very fascinating and provocative, even more for someone in a chair position like I am. Following on that question, sometimes you hear a different opinion on, taking an individual perspective as opposed to a system perspective. And sometimes you hear, talking about we should not overcorrect and we should not make current people paying for, something that their ancestor did. On the other hand, we know that if this was not equity, diversity, and inclusion, sometimes in life you have to overcorrect to get where you want faster. Steering, you may oversteer to keep the car on the road and so on. What your sense or what your suggestion would be around this conversation?
Yeah, it's a great conversation, and first of all, I think these conversations are really important to have. With a sense of openness to hear their perspective. If I give an example, Alfonso, one area would be, for example, the Canada Research Chair program. I often hear from some saying like, I can't get one and I'm really good, but I can't get one anymore because I'm not from an equity deserving group. And so I will say, let's have a conversation about that. In order to have the conversation, I have to understand the history of the program. And the history of the program is, when it was initiated, there were 8 women across the country who didn't receive a CRC at their university, and they were really excellent scientists. So they banded together and launched a human rights complaint about that at the federal level. And the ruling was in their favor. And so from that, the universities were told, okay, you have to be more deliberate and considerate of gender, just gender, in your CRC selections. And they went back and looked about 10 years later, and the marginal increase in percent of women in CRC just went up like, I think 4.5%. And 2 of those 8 women had passed away. Okay, so it gets to the length of time here. Then from that, they went and got a federal court order the 6 remaining women. The federal court order, now it's funny, ordering the government to not disperse funds until the universities have shown how they're actually meeting the gender target, and expanded now to include 3 additional groups: Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and people of color. Okay, so now when someone says like, I'm not getting one, I try and explain the history of why we're at where we're at. And unfortunately in this space, when equity initiatives are linked to funding, then the university will say like, we need these spots. Okay, we're going to do better. Every single time it's linked to funding, people do better. It's just, that's human nature, I think. So that's why we're at where we're at. It's unfortunate for some individuals who won't be able to apply to some competitions, but there's still other competitions. So, I just try and explain the history. And I also think it's really important as leaders, we don't give off the cuff remarks like, yeah, you're not going to get one because you're a man. Like, let's stop, have the conversation, explain the history, and then I think people get it a bit more.
Thank you.
Difficult conversations to have, there's no doubt. But in the long run, I think things haven't changed quite as much as the fear seems to reflect. So you're saying only 4%, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
we're doing better now because that federal court order came out probably about 5 years ago. But individuals really can make a difference in the system. And so again, measuring where we're at, if there's apathy to even measure where we're at by people, then that's problem number 1. So it really rests on people here saying like, I'm wondering, what is the breakdown of the CRCs at MAC? And then have the conversation with your leader, be it your department chair or the vice chair of research, and say, okay, how can we get to this point? And those conversations, both sides learn. The person who's saying like, I need change fast, learns it takes time. And the leader sitting in their office realizes, wow, people are really talking about this, like at the grassroots level. There are good candidates I didn't think about. So rather than just handing out research chairs to people I know, I'm going to create to the best of my ability, a fair competition, and may the best succeed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that transparency of process makes a big difference in that. So then everybody knows, and also everybody can see what they need to do to advance in the ways that they need to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the flip side of my question was going to be, my earlier question was going to be, what are the challenges we're still facing? And I don't know if there's one or two things that you think that we could be doing better, like at the top of your mind, that before we end, unless there are further questions, but I'm not seeing any other hands up.
Yeah, so, there's so many things, like there's so many areas we could go into. I described gender, racialization. I think, Indigenous reconciliation requires its own discussion, its own strategy, and then intersectionality. I think having, at the very least, I think areas where we can make a difference would be look at your own department, get to know what the issues are in your department for faculty. Is it gender? Is it race? Is it something else like inequity and base salary? That's definitely something in my department, and there's different billing opportunities. We've had those conversations. So what are the kind of pressing issues in your department? And then, at the senior level, say, okay, how can we address these?
Yeah, and we're also introducing it into our teaching and giving opportunities for people to develop their educational sessions or their courses in ways to start thinking about this kind of inclusion in understanding health systems and research, but also in the methodologies that they're using, and rethinking those skill sets. So I wish we could go on. I have lots of questions and lots to say, but we should let you go. I think for us, this is just an ongoing, a continuing conversation. And for those who are still interested and haven't had an opportunity to join the working group, feel free to get in touch with me or with Vanessa Castrati in admin to follow up, and we'd be glad to add you to that list. But Sonia, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing on this in the midst of everything else and the busiest years for physicians as well as academics. It's been wonderful that you've taken this on. If there's anything we can do, let us know. Thank you.
And thank you, Lisa, for your participation and all my requests to review EDI statements, etc. Appreciate that.
That's been fascinating. So I'm glad to continue. Thanks,
Bye
everyone. Thanks for
Take
taking
care.
the time. Bye. Thanks.